Have you ever tried to be silent and immediately realized how loud you are? No, not outside, but inside. You know, you sit down for prayer or silence, or just a few quiet minutes with God. Suddenly your mind is everywhere. You know, the thing you forgot to do, the conversation you wish had gone differently, the worry you can't quite shake, the insecurity that keeps asking, am I enough? And that's why in this series, I think be silent may be even more radical than flee. Because flee asks us to step away from the noise around us, but be silent asks us to face the noise within us. You know, flee asks us to turn off the distractions, but be silent asks us to stop using words and exclamations and arguments and opinions and inner commentary to hold ourselves together. And that's hard. You know, I'm not speaking about this as someone who sits down every morning and immediately enters perfect peace. You know, most mornings I'm still continually chasing thoughts. But after years of practicing contemplative prayer, I've started to see that why the old desert fathers and mothers took silence so seriously. Because silence isn't empty. Silence reveals, and silence burns, and silence opens. In this video, I want to walk through 3 gifts of silence given to us on the contemplative path. Henri Nouwen writes about them in The Ways of the Heart, and he says, "Solitude is the furnace of transformation. Without solitude, we remain victims of our society and continue to be entangled in the illusions of the false self. Jesus himself entered into this furnace. There he was tempted with the 3 compulsions of the world: to be relevant, to be spectacular, and to be powerful. There he affirmed God as the only source of his identity. Solitude is the place of the great struggle and the great encounter. The struggle against the compulsions of the false self and the encounter with the loving God who offers himself as the substance of the new self." So here's what we're going to unpack. Now, first, silence cuts through the illusions and reveals the false self. Second, silence becomes the great struggle and the furnace of transformation. And third, silence opens us to the great encounter and the fullness of the present moment. But the strange thing is the first gift may not feel like a gift at all. Because often when we enter silence, the first thing we meet is not peace. It's everything we've been using noise to avoid. This whole series is built around a simple problem. Many of us have learned how to believe in God without learning how to actually remain in God. You know, we know the verses, we believe the doctrines, we may go to church, you know, serve and pray and read and try to live faithfully. But underneath all of that, many of us are still restless. We're still anxious, still performing. We're still living from the false self while sincerely believing in Christ. And that's why the early desert fathers and mothers gave us these 3 movements: flee, be silent, and pray continuously. In the last video, we talked about flee. You know, fleeing the things that are constantly shaping us without us even noticing. You know, the phone, the feed, the outrage, the comparison, the endless entertainment. And that matters because our hearts are always being formed by something. You know, but fleeing is not the whole journey. Flee turns down the outer noise, and silence reveals the inner noise. Because when the noise stops, we often expect peace. But many times the first thing we meet is not peace. It's restlessness, it's anxiety and boredom. And if we misunderstand that, we'll think we're failing. We'll think, I'm bad at silence. I'm bad at prayer. You know, I'm not contemplative enough. But what if that's not failure? What if that's the beginning of the work? What if silence is not first a place of peace, but a place of truth? And that brings us to the first gift of silence. The first gift of silence is that it cuts through illusion and it reveals. Nouwen says that without solitude, we remain entangled in the illusions of the false self. And that word matters, illusions. Because the false self does not usually feel false to us. It feels necessary. It feels responsible. It feels like survival. But silence begins to show us what noise has been helping us avoid. And again, that may not feel like a gift at first because most of us do not want to see the false self. We want to improve it. We want to make it more religious. We want to make it look humble and loving and spiritual. But silence has a way of exposing what is really going on underneath. Again, Henri Nouwen, in The Way of the Heart, says that in solitude, Jesus faced the three compulsions of the false self: to be relevant, to be spectacular, and to be powerful. And those may sound dramatic, but they show up in ordinary ways. Relevant is the part of me that needs to prove I matter. And spectacular is the part of me that needs to be seen as impressive. And then powerful is the part of me that needs to stay in control. And you see, silence threatens all three. Because in silence, I'm not explaining myself. I'm not proving myself. I'm not managing how I'm perceived. I'm simply there, before God. And that can feel surprisingly vulnerable. James says, "Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak." And I don't think that is just good advice for conversations. I think it's a whole way of being. Because to be slow to speak means I'm no longer letting the false self speak first. I'm no longer letting fear grab the microphone. I'm no longer letting anxiety narrate reality. And that's why be silent is so radical. Because it's not just not talking. It's about no longer needing to talk in order to secure yourself. A simple way to picture this is like a clear stream. If nobody disturbs it, you can see straight through to the bottom. You can see the rocks. You can see the branches. You can see the shape of the stream bed. But when someone walks through it, all the silt rises and the water gets cloudy and everything becomes stirred up. And when the water is cloudy, you may stumble over rocks and branches beneath the surface, things you can't see clearly. And I think our inner life is often like that. There's things beneath the surface, our old fears, unhealed wounds, there's desires that have become disordered, the need to be safe, the need to be relevant, spectacular, or powerful. These things shape the way we move through life, even when we don't see them clearly. And because our lives are so constantly stirred up with noise and motion and talking, and scrolling and explaining, we rarely get a clear look at what is actually underneath. We just keep tripping over it. We keep reacting from it. We keep wondering why the same patterns show up again and again. Why do I become defensive so quickly? Why do I feel threatened when I'm not in control? Why do I keep reaching for distraction when I feel alone? Why does silence feel so unsafe? But when we become still, the silt begins to settle. The water begins to clear. And slowly we start to see what has been underneath the surface. Stillness doesn't put the obstacles there. Stillness reveals what has been shaping the flow all along. And this is where healing begins, because we can't surrender what we've refused to see. We can't offer to God what we keep buried beneath the noise. So silence becomes a mercy. It gives us enough clarity to notice the obstacles. Not so we can shame ourselves, not so we can obsess over ourselves, but so we can bring what is hidden into the presence of God. And so that's the first gift of silence. The first gift is sight. Silence reveals the false self. And for me, one of the rocks under the surface has been my desire for purpose. Since 2019, I've practiced contemplative prayer almost every morning for about 20 minutes, and often in the evening as well. And I wish I could tell you that, after all these years, I sit down and close my eyes and I'm immediately resting in the presence of God with total peace. But most mornings, it still feels like I'm chasing my thoughts. I sit down and I return to God, and then I start thinking about something I need to do later. And then I return again. Then I'm imagining a conversation, and I return again. Then I'm trying to solve a problem, I return again. Then I'm wondering if I'm even doing prayer right, and I return again. And sometimes it feels like that's all I did, return and wander, return and wander. But over time, something has happened. Silence has shown me things I couldn't see while I was moving. One of the things it keeps revealing is my desire for purpose. And that sounds good. We should want our lives to matter. We should want to serve God. We should want to offer ourselves in love. But in silence, I've started to see that my desire for purpose isn't always as pure as I want it to be. Sometimes I don't want purpose because I want to serve. Sometimes I want purpose because I want proof that I matter. I want something I can point to and say, see, I am useful. I'm valuable. I have a place. And that is the need to be relevant. It's not just the desire to serve. It's the false self trying to build an identity out of usefulness. And silence exposes that. Because in silence, I'm not producing anything. I'm not impressing anyone. I'm not proving anything. I'm just there before God. And that can sound beautiful, but it can also feel terrifying. Because the false self doesn't know how to simply be loved. It only knows how to perform. Only knows how to prove and explain and control. But silence does more than just reveal. If we stay with God in what has been revealed, silence becomes something deeper. Nouwen says solitude is not only the place where illusions are exposed, it's also the place of the great struggle. Because once the false self is revealed, the question becomes, will I keep obeying it, or will I surrender it to God? And that's where silence becomes the furnace of transformation. It burns, because a furnace isn't cozy. It's not sentimental. It's not soft background music and a candle and a perfectly peaceful soul. A furnace is hot. A furnace purifies. A furnace burns away what can't remain. And this is why silence can feel so uncomfortable. Because silence is one of the places where God begins to burn away the illusions of the false self. Not to destroy us, but to free us. To bring us back to the self whose life is hidden with Christ in God. To bring us back to the self that receives identity instead of manufacturing it. The false self says, be relevant and be spectacular and be powerful. But God says, you are my beloved. You don't have to earn your place. You don't have to construct an identity strong enough to survive. You can receive your life from me. And this is why silence is not just self-awareness. It's not just introspection. It's not just noticing our thoughts. Silence is the place where what has been revealed can be surrendered. And this brings us to a tender but serious question. How deep do we actually want to go? Because most of us want depth with God. We want freedom, we want peace, we want union. But depth with God is proportional to depth of surrender. We can't go deep with God while clinging tightly to the self we've spent our whole lives constructing. At some point, the invitation becomes very simple and, frankly, very terrifying. Are you willing to surrender who you think you are so you can receive who you actually are in God? Evelyn Underhill in Practical Mysticism says, selfhood must be killed before reality can be attained. And that can sound kind of harsh to modern ears. But she's not saying our personhood has to be destroyed. She's talking about the false, possessive, self-enclosed ego, the self curved in on itself. As long as I'm ruled by that self, as long as I'm governed by self-protection and self-importance and self-centered attachment, I can't see reality as it truly is. I can't see God clearly. I can't see myself clearly. And I can't see the present moment clearly. And so at the deepest levels, this means giving up the identity I thought I had to protect. Jesus says, whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. And that's not just a call to a heroic sacrifice someday in the future. It's the daily surrender of my identity now. And this is why stillness can feel like death. Because something in us really is being asked to die. Not the true self, not the self loved into being, but the false self that has been pretending to be us. The false self that has been exhausting us. The false self that has been standing between us and union. If you want to go deep, this is the doorway. Not more information, not more religious performance. Surrender. The deeper the surrender, the deeper the freedom. And the deeper the surrender, the deeper the union. Because union is not something we achieve by becoming impressive. Union is what we discover when we stop clinging to everything that is not God. And in that surrender, we don't become less ourselves. We become more truly ourselves than we've ever been. We lose the self we were never meant to carry. And we receive the life that has been hidden in God all along. And that is the second gift of silence. Silence becomes the furnace of transformation. It reveals what is false, and it burns away what can't remain. And it frees us to receive our life from God. But then as we surrender the false self, something else begins to open. We begin to discover that God wasn't waiting for us somewhere far away. God was here all along. Which brings us to the third gift of silence, which is presence. And this is where Nouwen's phrase becomes so beautiful. Because solitude is not only the place of the great struggle, it's also the place of the great encounter. We don't enter silence only to face what is false. We enter silence to meet the God who's been loving us underneath it all. Because the furnace is not just where we face our compulsions. It's where we meet the God who loves us beneath them. See, once silence reveals the false self, and once we begin to surrender that false self in the furnace of God's love, we begin to discover something we were too distracted to see. That God is here now. Not after we fix everything, not after we become more impressive and more useful or more spiritual. No, he's here now. That's why Psalms 46 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Now, I used to hear that mostly as comfort, like God was saying, "Relax, take a breath. Everything will be okay." And sure, there's comfort in it, but there's also surrender, saying, "Be still. Stop striving, stop performing, stop trying to be God. Be still and know that I am God." Silence is where we stop trying to be the source of our own identity. And we begin to receive God as the source of our life. And when that happens, the present moment begins to open. Because I think many of us avoid silence, not only because we're afraid of what we might feel, but because we're afraid there won't be enough there. We've been trained to believe that life is found somewhere else, in the next accomplishment or the next task or the next purpose, the next project or improvement. We keep moving because we're afraid that if we stop, the moment will feel empty. And maybe we will feel empty too. And I think this is part of the great encounter. We discover that God is not only present in the dramatic spiritual moments, God is present in the ordinary we keep trying to escape. Richard Rohr echoes this, and he says, "The contemplative secret is learning to live in the now, which is not as empty as it might appear to be or that we fear it may be. Try to realize that everything is right here, right now, and God is in this moment in a non-blaming way." See, I love that phrase. It's not as empty as we fear it may be, because that's exactly what silence begins to heal in us. Silence exposes the lie that this moment is not enough, that ordinary life is not enough, that God's presence here is not enough. The false self keeps chasing life somewhere else because it doesn't trust that God can be found here. But the contemplative tradition keeps inviting us back to the same hidden truth, that this moment isn't empty. God is here, not only in the meaningful moments, not only in the productive moments. God is here now. In the ordinary, in the quiet, in the hidden place where no one is watching. And this changes everything because if God is here, then this moment isn't empty. If God is here, then silence isn't absence. If God is here, then I don't have to keep chasing life somewhere else. You see, the false self is always trying to get life from the world. But the true self begins to discover that life is received in God's presence, simply and quietly. And now, this is what we begin to taste in solitude, the fullness of now. Not some other moment, not some other better version of our life, not someday when everything finally settles down. This moment, this ordinary moment of getting the kids ready for school, or this mundane Monday where you're going to work, this moment of fear, this moment of sorrow, this moment when I feel distracted or restless or weak. It doesn't matter how ordinary the moment seems. It doesn't matter how imperfect I feel inside of it. Rohr continues on. Because most of our moments are not tasted or in the presence, we are never full. We create artificial fullness and want to hang on to that. But there's nothing to hold on to when we begin to taste the fullness of now. God is either in this now or God isn't at all. If the now has never been sufficient, we'll always be grasping. Here's a litmus test. If we're pushing ourselves and others around, we haven't yet found the secret of happiness. This moment is as full of the divine presence as it can be. This moment is already as full of the divine presence as it can possibly be. You know, God isn't waiting for me in some imagined future where I'm calmer or holier or more put together. He is here now. The only question is whether I am present enough to receive him. And that may be one of the deepest gifts of silence. Silence doesn't make God more present. Silence helps me stop running from the presence that is already here. I just have to get out of the way. And once you begin to taste even a little of that presence, not as an idea, not as doctrine, but as reality, something in you starts to change. You begin to realize that you weren't made to live on noise. You weren't made to live on distraction. You weren't made to live on the constant pressure to explain yourself or prove yourself or somehow hold yourself together. You were made to live in God. And once your soul begins to taste that, even faintly, it starts to hunger for the silence that makes room for him. And that's the third gift. Silence opens us to the fullness of the present moment. So silence reveals, silence burns, and silence opens. It opens us to presence. But how do we actually practice this? How do we enter silence without turning it into just another performance? And that's where contemplative prayer comes in. Contemplative prayer is an ancient practice. It's a quiet, receptive way of being with God beyond words, where we lovingly turn our attention towards his presence and consent to his transforming work within us. So if you're new to this, start small. Start with 5 minutes and build up from there. You don't have to start some heroic desert monk version of prayer where you immediately become silent enough to levitate. Just 5 minutes. I even set a timer on my phone so I'm not always checking the time. Sit somewhere quiet. Let your body become still. Take a few slow breaths and place yourself in the presence of God. You might use a simple prayer word or phrase when you get distracted. Something like, Jesus, Abba, or Lord have mercy. The point isn't exactly some specific word. The point is consent. You're consenting to God's presence and action within you. And then when thoughts come, because they will, you don't need to fight them. You just say your prayer word as a kind of a focus and return. It's like sitting on the bank of a river, watching boats go by, and you notice them, but you let them go by. What you're trying to do is when a boat comes by, you don't want to get up and go exploring all over the boat. You just want to notice it and let it go by. So when anxiety rises, don't shame yourself. Notice it, see it coming down the river, and maybe say your prayer word and let it go and just return. When a worry comes, notice it and return. When a memory comes, notice and return. A random thought about whether you replied to that text comes, again, you just notice it and you return. You see, you're not failing when you return. Returning is the practice. Every return is a small act of surrender. Every return is a way of saying, I don't have to follow every thought. I don't have to obey every fear. I don't have to build an identity out of every desire. I return to God. I receive my life from him. Some people think contemplative prayer is working only if they feel peaceful while they're doing it. But some of the most important sits may feel like nothing is happening. It may feel like you're just chasing thoughts. It may feel like you're not accomplishing anything. But over time, something begins to shift. You may notice it when you're driving and anxiety rises, but you don't immediately obey it. You may notice it in a hard conversation when you feel the need to defend yourself, but you pause instead. You may notice it when your false self wants to be seen and you can gently smile at that part of you instead of being ruled by it. Or you may notice it, when you're doing something ordinary and for just a moment you become aware that God is there. That is the fruit. Peace throughout your day. Presence in ordinary life. Freedom from having to answer every voice. A slower, deeper awareness that your identity isn't something you have to build. It's something you receive. Again, so begin with 5 minutes. And when it feels like failure, don't assume nothing is happening. The furnace may already be doing its work. So be silent is radical, not because words are bad, not because silence makes us, more spiritual than everyone else. Be silent is radical because it interrupts the false self's need to constantly speak and explain and defend or impress. Silence cuts through illusion and reveals the false self. And silence becomes the great struggle, the furnace where the false self can be surrendered. And then silence opens us to the great encounter where we discover that God has not been far away. He is here now. And that's the movement of this series. Flee removes the noise. Silence reveals what the noise was hiding. And prayer turns the revealed heart back towards God. Because silence isn't the end of the contemplative path. Silence opens the door. It reveals the heart. It clears the stream. It brings us into the furnace. So be sure to like and subscribe, because once the heart is revealed, the next invitation is to return to God again and again. Until prayer is no longer just something we do for a few quiet minutes, but it becomes the atmosphere of our life. And that's where we have to go next. Pray continuously.